Hey folks, welcome back to the Workman's podcast. And today we're going to be taking a brief look at the gospel according to Luke. And as we've been going through these various gospel accounts, we're trying to look at them and understand the differences between them. Obviously, all four of these are telling the greatest story ever told. They're telling us the story in which we find redemption, in which we find God's love and concern for mankind in Christ, who came, lived, died, and rose again so that we could have salvation. So each of these four gospel accounts are telling that story, but we're going through and we're trying to look at, okay, what was the intention and the purpose in writing each of these accounts? We talked about how Matthew wrote to the Jews with an intention of showing that Jesus was the fulfillment of prophecy, that he was the fulfillment, that he was the Messiah that the Jews were supposed to be looking for. Talked about how Mark wrote a short, brief, straight to the point gospel to make it clear that Jesus was the one who came to save all mankind. And now we're going to move on to Luke, and Luke starts out in a little bit different way where he makes his intentions very clear from the get-go. We learn that in his writing, he is writing to an individual rather than a group, as we have seen in the last couple of these examples. So here in Luke's, we notice that Luke was written by, obviously, the man Luke, and we can find Luke and follow him throughout some of the book of Acts and see that for some amount of time he traveled along with Paul. In Colossians chapter 4 and verse 14, we learn that he is a physician, that he is this man who would have been knowledgeable and also a traveler with Paul, as Paul says, Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. We look at Luke and we see this man who would have been knowledgeable, who would have been intelligent, who would have known things about the human body. And here we get to see his account of the story of Christ. But one thing that is interesting that I think we can find out about Luke's account is that Luke, I don't think, ever actually saw Christ, or at least he was not a follower of Christ in the way that, for example, we saw Matthew and will see John. And I believe he admits as much when we look to Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. He says, inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order the narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having had perfected understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed. We learn a lot in those first four verses. We learn, of course, who was writing, his intention of writing. We learn some problems that were going on, and then also who Luke was writing to, a man named Theophilus. And we learn that he is a powerful, a well-respected man who Luke actually writes two letters to, the book of Luke and then the book of Acts, to tell him of the things of Christ and then the things that were being done within the church. And it seems as though with an intention to make him or have him understand that Christ truly was the Messiah. But as we look to Luke's account, I believe it becomes very clear that Luke gathered information from those people he was around. We know he was around Paul. We know he was around other Christians and probably some of those who traveled with Christ. There in verses 2 and 3, it says, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and minister of the world delivered them to us. It seems as though he was investigating. The verbiage that's there in verse 3 gives the idea of someone who is really flushing out the information, someone who is tracing this story through with the mind. It implies this idea that Luke was taking observation from the people who were telling them. It seems as though Luke is searching out the stories of eyewitnesses and compiling the life of Christ and a complete narrative of the things that happened with him. But we also see that Luke set out to correct error. It says there are some who have written things that were imperfect. There in verses 2 and 3, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also having had perfect understanding of the things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, O most excellent Theophilus, that you may know with certainty. What we can learn about the beginning of, this time in the first century, in the beginning there in the church, there were some who would try and get in on this hype or on this idea of trying to get some fame by writing a gospel account, and some of these would not have the effectiveness or the accuracy that should be desired by someone who was inspired in their writing, as we believe that Luke was. So it seems as though there were some false gospels that were floating around, and Luke writes with the intention of putting things in order, with being perfect, and with being accurate in the things that he writes. Now, I do want to make this point, that as we look at Luke and we recognize that he went in with an intention of compiling the things from eyewitnesses, this does not negate the fact that he was inspired by the Holy Spirit. We understand that Luke's gospel account was fully inspired, and because of that, we are able to trust it fully. But Luke is able to take these things that he's learned, and then through inspiration is able to share the exact things that happened with Christ with perfect accuracy. And I believe that this is one of the themes that we need to take from the Gospel of Luke. It is a theme of accuracy, of precision. When we look at Luke, if you think about his life as a physician, as a man who is well respected, who is doing a job that is very important, it would be necessary that he looked for and strove for perfection and accuracy. And throughout the book of Luke, we can see that it seems like, or in my opinion, he gives more detail than any of the other gospel accounts, especially in the things that can be tested. When you look at his gospel, it was accurate in every way. In it, he mentions 32 individual countries, 54 cities, 9 Mediterranean islands, 4 Roman emperors, and various other political offices. And as we have moved throughout history, as we look to archaeology, as we look to the historical records and accounts that we have outside of the Bible, we recognize that all these things that Luke said are archaeologically, are historically, are geographically correct in their context of what Luke was writing about. What Luke was doing was giving an account of Christ that could be tested, that could be checked, and that could prove that a man named Jesus Christ came to this world, lived a perfect life, was the Messiah, was put to death for sins that he had not committed, and absolutely rose again. In this book, we see these historical facts that make it so difficult to deny the authenticity and the accuracy of the story of Christ as Luke lays it out before us. But in this realm, or in this idea of accuracy and perfection, we also see that Luke writes with the intention to show that Jesus was also perfect. While Luke focuses on an accuracy and a perfection in his way of laying out the gospel, he also points out Christ's perfection. Now, the person that Luke was writing to was Theophilus. He was a Greek, and when we look at the Greeks, we understand they often focused on the perfect man. They strived to understand the human body, to look at the things that they could learn through knowledge, through understanding, and through study. And in this, we also see that Luke points out the perfection of Christ. He points out that all the things that he did were perfect and that they were true. He points them out for a reason, that Jesus is the one who was the perfect man, and by whom the rest of man can become perfect. Luke's gospel is one that is built out of accuracy. If you want to look to a historical account of Jesus, if you want to look for things that can be proven and can be sure, Luke's gospel account is the one for you. But I want to leave us with one final passage that I believe kind of wraps up or can be used for a theme of much of what Luke points out and brings out. And this is Luke chapter 19, verses 5 through 10. Here it says, "When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him, and said to him, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must abide at thy house. And he made haste, and he came down, and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, they all murmured, saying that he was gone to be a guest with a man that is a sinner. And Zacchaeus stood and said unto the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I have taken anything from any man by false accusation, I restore him fourfold. And Jesus said unto him, This day is salvation come to this house, for as much as he is a son of Abraham, for the Son of Man is come to seek and to save that which is lost." Here we see the account of Zacchaeus, a man who was small in stature but climbed a tree to see Christ. And Jesus speaks to him, and the people disapproved because Zacchaeus was a tax collector and a sinner as they saw him. But the Lord goes to Zacchaeus' house. Zacchaeus repents. And what we see is the juxtaposition, the comparison of the perfection of Christ and the flawed aspects of mankind. And in that final verse, verse 10, "For the Son of Man is come to seek and to save that which is lost," we find ourselves. We see that Christ's purpose upon this earth, and what Luke points out in his gospel, is that Christ is perfect. That he is the Messiah, the Son of God, who's committed no sin, but he came to this earth in love to seek those who have sinned and wandered away from God and to bring us to salvation. Luke's account is probably my favorite of the four gospel accounts because of how many different small details you can look at and point out, and how you can prove the way that Jesus truly was the Son of God. I hope this has been beneficial to you. Obviously, all of these gospel accounts deserve your focus and your study. But if this is something that you are looking for, I would encourage you to look to the Gospel of Luke. And I hope that we remember that the Son of Man did not come to save those that were already perfect, but rather to take flawed mankind, to make us perfect, and to seek and save those which were lost. Thank you all so much for watching. We'll see you next time.